Part 1, My Story. Chapter 1, Beginnings. I was born in Holland, but my roots go back to where my parents came from, Poland. My parents came from different villages, so they hadn't known each other before they left Poland. Both families were very poor and had been subjected to racial persecution and pogroms after World War I. My mother's early years were truly wretched. She received very little education and even less affection, given that her own mother had died when she was a little girl. Her father sent her away to live with relatives when she was 12 because he could not afford to support her. Although the people who took her in were family, they did not treat her as a member of their family. In fact, she was little more than a maid in their house. She had to prepare and serve the family meals, but was not invited to eat with them. She had a little stool in the kitchen where she ate by herself. All of these factors affected her and shaped her life. My mother's name was Ethel Schiffman. Mina Adler was her first cousin and closest friend when she was growing up, and they remained best friends for as long as they lived. They left Poland and went to Holland together when they were both 19. I believe they chose Holland because it was more tolerant to Jews, and they thought there was more opportunity to make a living there than there was in Poland. They ended up in the city of Leiden, where they survived by working in a factory as sewing machine operators. Both women met their husbands-to-be in Leiden. Like my mother, my father, Bernard Konigsberg, came from Poland. When my father was born, his family name was Spurgel. After the First World War, Poland moved back and forth between being an independent state and part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Different laws applied under each regime. My grandparents were married in a religious ceremony which was recognized by the state to be a legal marriage at the time. However, when my father applied for a passport, which he needed in order to leave Poland, the regime in power at the time raised some questions as to the legality of his parents' marriage. So tracing his origins back to a great-grandmother, whose name was Konigsberg, he changed his name from Spurgel to Konigsberg. My father's mother, Miriam, died when he was 13. He had been very close to her and was devastated when she died. On the other hand, he had a strained relationship with his father, who was very authoritarian, a cold, strict person who showed his son little affection. However, he made sure his son received a sound Jewish and Hebrew education. My father loved Judaic studies and was very serious about them, so much so that he became a kazan and officiated at religious services for most of his adult life. Not long after my grandmother died, my grandfather married his wife's sister. Apparently, my father found that very hard to accept, so when he was 14, he left his father's house and moved to another village where he got a job in a shoe store. Like my mother, he was 19 when he set out for Holland. My parents met at a Jewish social club and meeting house in Leiden, where newcomers to Holland used to get together. They married when my dad was 23. My mother was 3 years older. They lived in a small room with little more than the bare necessities. Their bed was a pile of straw on the floor. They both eked out an existence as peddlers until I was born on July 6, 1935, about a year after they were married. My mother got a sewing machine in their room soon after I was born. She did some sewing for a manufacturer and stayed home with me while my father continued to peddle. My mother often told me about breastfeeding me for a long time, much longer than was usual even in those days, because that was the only way she could feed me. She fed herself, and so she was able to breastfeed me. That was our life in Holland, barely getting by. About the same time as my parents met, Mina met Jakob Zieler, who came from Germany. They also married, and our two families were inseparable from then on. My Tante Mina and my Uncle Jakob were my godparents. In the late 20s, Hitler began making a lot of worrying noises, and by the early 30s, his threats were becoming ominous. My father and some of his friends were convinced that Hitler was dangerous, so they conceived a plan to leave Europe. It wasn't easy for a Jew to leave Europe in those days. There were few countries willing to accept Jews, and those that did, like countries in South America, were half a world away. By 1935, Canada and the United States were already closed to Jews. Leaving Europe at the time meant leaving family and friends behind with the real prospect of never seeing them again. That was not an easy thing to do. None of my father's friends had much money, but one of them, Moshe Altman, decided to be a pioneer. In 1931, he and his eldest son, Herschel Henry, left their family, boarded a ship, and set out for South America. The ship made a stop in Barbados, by which time they had enough of sea travel. They simply got off the ship and didn't get back on. Mr. Altman decided to make Barbados home and started peddling. In a short time, he saw the prospects for making a living, and eventually he was able to send for the rest of his family. As the pioneer, Mr. Altman had agreed to keep in touch with the other members of the group and to let them know whether they should follow him or not. So as soon as he was settled, he wrote to his friend Yankel Bernstein, my father's best friend, and told him it was all right for him to come. So Mr. Bernstein followed Mr. Altman to Barbados. After Mr. Bernstein was settled, he wrote letters to 3 people in Europe. One was to my father, saying, "I am peddling here and it's okay for you to come, so make your arrangements and come." He sent a similar letter to his brother-in-law in Poland and also told him to come. The third letter was to his friend Mr. Korn, which said, "Don't come, because if there are too many of us peddling here, none of us will make a living." Several months went by, then my father arrived, and a while later Mr. Korn appeared. Understandably, Mr. Bernstein was surprised to see Mr. Korn, and he asked him, "How come you came? I wrote you not to come." And Mr. Korn answered, "Well, I didn't get the letter you wrote me. I got the letter you wrote to your brother-in-law. It was in the envelope addressed to me. The letter said to come, and I assumed you meant the same for me, so I came." In the meantime, Mr. Bernstein's brother-in-law received the letter intended for Mr. Korn, telling him not to come, and like Mr. Korn, he assumed the message was the same for him, so he stayed where he was. In those days, it took a long time for a letter to travel from Barbados to Poland, and even though Mr. Bernstein wrote to his brother-in-law immediately, it was too late for him to get himself and his family out of Poland. Soon after the war started, he and his entire family perished at Hitler's hands, all because of a mix-up in letters. I was 1 year old in 1936 when my father left my mother and me in Holland and set out for Barbados. He was a young man of 25. When I was a youngster, I remember him telling me that he had only a few pennies to his name when it was time for him to board the ship. He was a smoker, and he was hoping to use what little money he had to buy a few cigarettes on the voyage. But as he was going up the gangplank, he looked back at my mother on the dock with me in her arms, and he took out his small packet of coins, literally all the money he had in the world, and threw it to her. I can only guess that he was overcome by the grim realization that he might never see us again, and so he set out alone and penniless for Barbados.